Okay, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Lindsey. Together with Holly, we form a small legislation team within land resource management in the government of Jersey. Our main responsibilities are administering the wildlife law. We also administer aspects of the planning building law relating to protected habitats like sites of special interest. We oversee the external reporting requirements under our international obligations, and we also play a key role in. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So, Holly and I, is that better?
Yes, thank you.
We have a rather tricky role, I consider, because we're here to administer the law and regulate it, ensure compliance, administer licenses, but we've also got to try and get that message across that actually the law is there for a purpose, to conserve our wildlife, and by encouraging people to adhere to the law, it's actually a good thing ultimately for the benefit of our wildlife. So we thought we'd talk today about the guidance. There's provision in the wildlife law for guidance to be produced. And we thought we'd talk about that, what the implications of the guidance is for those working with protected species, the general public. Holly will give an overview of the guidance that we have produced to date, what our plans are, and some of the challenges that we have in getting the message across and communicating that guidance to what is really a wide-ranging audience. So many of you will be familiar with our wildlife law. It's the main law that protects wildlife in Jersey, but importantly, it's the key instrument that fulfills our international obligations for the conservation of biodiversity under a range of multilateral environmental agreements. It's got quite a complex hierarchical setup, which actually is a reflection of the international obligations. It provides different levels of protection for species, which is the reflection of their international status and their listing on the appendices to the various conventions. And then finally, it provides a framework within activities, whether positive activities such as research, conservation, as well as control of species can be carried out. I thought it would be useful just to mention here that the wildlife law does only deal primarily with wild species, and so there are definitions in the law to clarify that a wild animal, a wild bird, is one that's not captive bred. It's of a species that's naturally occurring in the island and living wild. So, for example, a captive bred barn owl would be not deemed to be protected under the law, but it would be the responsibility of the person who is in possession of that species to be able to demonstrate that it's captive bred, and similarly with the wild plants. So these are the schedules to the wildlife law, quite a number of them. As I say, they are fairly complex, which is one of the reasons for which we're going to talk about the guidance later on. Essentially, Schedules 1, 2, and 8 for plants provide the basic level of protection from harm, damage for protected species. And then the other schedules in red here provide sort of higher levels of protection, and which are further explained in the guidance. And this is just a sort of a snapshot showing the different species groups and the levels of protection that they have. So bats, for example, have got the maximum protection under the law. They've got the basic level of protection under Schedule 1, but their roosting sites or dens, roosting sites are protected at all times, even when they're not present. And they're also disturbed as a species wherever they are. And we'll go on to talk about what we mean about disturbance as it applies later on. Similarly here, reptiles and amphibians, you can see there's quite a range here. Grass snake have got maximum protection under the law, whereas the green lizard, for example, it's protected from harm, but actually its den is not protected. So I'm just talking about some of the key terms defined in the law. There are some terms that are given in the law. Some of them are defined and explained, some aren't. And that's simply because it's really difficult to give a definition that applies to each individual species. We've got this overriding definition for deliberately and recklessly. There's actually quite a long definition given in the law itself, but essentially it means acting deliberately in the knowledge that an offence is likely to be caused without taking reasonable precautions. So that's where the guidance comes in, because the importance is that we need to put that message out there to say that, you know, you need to be aware that your pond has potential to be supporting protected species, and so you need to be acting with reasonable precautions. There's also reference to disturbance, and there's quite a long technical definition for disturbance. But when you look at it in detail, disturbance will mean something completely different to a grass snake than to a protected invertebrate, a swallowtail, for example. So again, that's where the guidance comes in. And then we've got a definition for in use. So a nest or a den is considered to be in use even though the bird or the animal is not present, and for as long as the offspring are dependent on that den or nest, which is, in practice, is very difficult to define. And there are also some terms in the law that are not defined and they're not interpreted. So taking, for example, breeding site, resting site, there's no definition because it would be difficult to provide a general definition that applies to all species. So that's where the guidance will come in. So talking about the guidance, quite unusually, there is a clear basis for the production of guidance in the law in Article 5, which says that the Minister may produce guidance. And actually, that guidance can be taken into account in court in cases of potential prosecution. So it's really important that we get that message out there. What have we done so far? Well, Holly's going to give an overview of the guidance documents that we've produced so far. A website has been established, and there's information on that website about the wildlife law, the lists of the protected species, what we're doing, and the licensing provisions, and the individual guidance. Holly will take over now. She'll talk about the guidance, what our next steps are, and talk about some of the challenges that we have in communicating that guidance.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Holly. I work directly with Lindsey in the legislation team and land resource management. So I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour, really, of the guidance that we have published for our protected species at the moment, what this guidance actually means in practice, and as Lindsey mentioned, the challenges surrounding that guidance. A lot of you are experts in the field, so I won't go into too much detail, but if we start with the protected bird species guidance, a breeding site is defined as a place where individuals or congregations will breed, nest and rear young, but it also is defined as the area that the bird requires around the nest to feel safe. So this obviously is very species specific. It depends on the type of species you're looking at. So for example, larger species like birds of prey, it might be a distinct nesting territory, or it might just be confined to the nest itself. So whether that be within an individual tree, a hedgerow, a nest box, or within a building, so like a barn swallow nest. A resting site is defined as the area habitually used for roosting, so starlings will collectively roost in trees, or for loafing, so this is a state of behaviour which is not directly connected to breeding or feeding, but it's kind of when they're awake but conserving energy. We've got a list on the left-hand side there of possible sources of disturbance. It's not an exhaustive list, but it kind of gives you an indication of the kind of activities that may cause disturbance to birds. And these sources of disturbance are also subject to the risk of disturbance. So what is the impact? Is it high, medium, low? What is the likelihood of that disturbance occurring? And what are the mitigation measures surrounding the disturbance? Okay, so if I move on to protected marine species guidance, this is quite a difficult one to define, and we don't have definitions for all the breeding resting sites for marine species that are protected under wildlife law, just because in some accounts, like marine turtles, we have no accounts of them laying eggs in Jersey waters. So that might just be confined to resting sites only. Other breeding sites may be for, other breeding sites, for example, the seals, that may include the upper intertidal zone, or just beyond the high water mark, both around Jersey and on the offshore reefs. Disturbance can be in water and on land for these species, and disturbance which are localised and temporary are unlikely to have prolonged effects to that species, for example, a sudden loud noise. But if it's affecting a larger area or an individual, then obviously the impact is going to be greater. It's not changing slides, sorry. Oh, there we are. Okay, moving on to protected amphibian and reptile species. Very difficult to define for some of our species. Our common toad, agile frog, wall lizard and grass snake are afforded full protection, their breeding and their resting sites. But there's differences between the different species groups. So for example, an amphibian might use quite a clearly recognisable habitat feature, such as in a pond, but reptile species are less obvious. And this could be kind of laying eggs within a wall, within some sort of crevice, or laying eggs within a compost heap. So it is quite hard to define. And also some species are dependent on that habitat and area. So the agile frog, it might be the pond itself, but actually it's really reliant on the surrounding habitat and area to be right as well. So whilst not all reptile and amphibian species breeding and resting sites aren't protected, a damage to or disturbance of such sites are likely to cause another offence, for example, injury or harm. Possible sources of disturbance here. So there's generally in the guidance 4 types of disturbance for reptile and amphibian groups. So this could be direct disturbance of the species with no physical contact, for example, human presence, dog presence. Direct disturbance, physical contact. This could be through like garden and maintenance works, accidental trampling. Any human activities which will have direct disturbance on the habitats themselves. And then also indirect effects of disturbance, such as littering, arson, which may then affect the breeding resting sites. Protected bat species guidance, very complex species. As Lindsay said, they're afforded the highest protection. So a place where bat lives is the roost. There's multiple different types of roosts for different times of the year, as I'm sure you're all aware. The table on the right just gives an indication of kind of typical roosting features, but if you look at the photo in the middle, typical barn structure, you will get multiple species roosting within that one area, so crevice dwellers, void dwellers. Source of disturbance, tree felling, building maintenance works. As Lindsay mentioned, we do a lot of work with developers, so impacts come in there. Artificial lighting, which actually has more of a direct impact on their foraging areas, or for example, a loss of a key commuting feature like hedgerow. So what does this all mean in practice? So as you can see from the guidance just discussed, the terminology surrounding breeding and resting sites for each species is quite complex. It often requires specialist knowledge, and what constitutes a disturbance offence, can be very complex. So in general, it just means taking those reasonable precautions to avoid acting deliberately or recklessly as defined in the law. So, can you time the works outside of the breeding bird season? Can you check for the presence of species before you undertake the activity of the works? Also being responsible for your own actions and for any contractors you're working with. Keeping a written and visual record. The use of the Jersey Biodiversity Record Centre, so can you look for protected species records before you do the activity or do the work? And when there are known breeding or resting sites, we can issue licences under the wildlife law for activities to be carried out. For larger landscaping and building works, usually a formal ecological application process is required. And if in doubt, we always encourage people to seek professional advice because, as you can see, our species are quite complex. Publications, we need to update our protected plants booklet. I don't know if you noticed, but we haven't actually currently got any guidance for invertebrates or small mammals, so we need to do that. And then there was also other guidances, like guidances on the broncage practice, marine coastal wildlife watching codes, bird watching, which just allows people to work to the best practice and consider wildlife at the forefront. Okay, so lastly, the next step. So as you can see, it's quite challenging. The law itself, the terminology around, the legal terminology can be quite difficult to interpret, and it doesn't always reach to all of our key target audiences. And actually written guidance is not always that engaging. So we're trying to work towards utilising other means of communication. How do we get that message across? For example, social media posts. We have a warden now on the team who can do regular patrols to ensure compliance under the wildlife law, but more importantly, just speak to people whilst out and about, whether that be someone working on site or members of the public. Reach out to wider audience. As I said, we've recently published in the Jersey Cruising Guide areas of special protection, and a part about there about protecting bird species at particular times of year. We're doing training for professionals, so working with arborists, doing annual arborist licenses, and getting everyone to work to best practice, checking for features before they carry out those works. And then also trying to highlight key pieces of work. So we are currently undertaking a big review at the moment, the Quinquennial Review, which is an approach undertaken in the UK, where we're reviewing all of our protected species, their current conservation status, and do they meet the international obligations. So we'll have the results of that coming out soon. So I think that's everything. Sorry, very quick tour, but it's, as you can see, it can be quite complex to get the message across in a positive and effective manner, but there's so much that we can do to kind of reach to that wider audience. Yeah, thank you.